To the CCAE webinar entitled Moving Adult Education Forward. I am delighted that so many of you could join us this afternoon. My name is Adriana Sanchez Aldana, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council for Adult Education. Today's webinar will be led by Don Koepke, CCAE's Legislative and Government Budget Advocate. Also providing technical support for the webinar is Sharon Bonney of Bonney Business Solutions and CCAE's Office Manager. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CCAE website later this week. Before passing the microphone to Dawn, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of you for the work that you have been doing and will continue to do for adult education. CCAE's work would not be possible without you. Without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dawn Koepke.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. Hopefully everyone's feeling good about the Super Bowl outcomes yesterday. I know we're rooting for their underdog in our world, so hopefully you're all energized and not only coming off of that, but also about the year ahead of us for adult education. We have a lot of great things ahead of us and are feeling quite optimistic and excited about what opportunities we have for us in this legislative and budget cycle. So with that, I wanted to chat with you about our agenda for the year. Hopefully many of you have seen our platform priorities framework document, but thought we would kind of run through a bit of kind of the last year, what we saw and occurred, what kind of progress is made, and then walk you through in detail kind of our platform for this year, which is really focused on kind of the future of adult education and ensuring that we have the opportunity to serve communities of need. So a legislative recap from last year, just kind of level sets going into the new year. In 2017, we saw a few pieces of legislation that CCAE and CAEAA took an active supporting role in. The first was by Senate Bill 68 by Senator Ricardo Lara, which dealt with non-resident tuition, particularly for kind of post-secondary education. Many of you may remember legislation passed many years ago under the guise of AB 540 that ensured that there was a pathway for students that were here in California, were California residents, but perhaps due to status couldn't necessarily qualify for assistance and for education benefits at the in-state cost rate. This provided some opportunities to kind of address some of the gaps there, and we were pleased to support that piece of legislation. Additionally, Assembly Bill 273 by Assemblymember Griar Curry. This bill dealt with child care services and CalWORKs and really ensuring that if a particular individual was participating in adult education programs and specifically referencing adult schools, that would help with eligibility for child care benefits under CalWORKs. And we also took a support role in that. And then finally, AB 1111 by Assemblyman Garcia. This was dealing with breaking barriers to employment and notably was sponsored in part by the California Workforce Association. Conceptually, the bill was very positive in that it really was focusing in on providing opportunities, funding, and a mechanism through Labor and Workforce Development Agency and with the Workforce Investment Boards and local community-based organizations to support outreach to marginalized populations and those that were hard to serve in terms of employment, basic skills, what have you. And while we certainly were very supportive of this, there was one concern just with the bill regarding not having an explicit requirement to align the work there to the work that is being done by you all in adult schools and our community college partners relative to the adult education block grant activities. And the concern given that, the whole AEBG in part was established based on wanting to kind of break down silos and create better opportunities for collaboration, coordination, and pathway development. And one concern we have with this bill is that although definitely aiming in the right direction, just no explicit requirement to coordinate those activities. So we did take just a support if amended position. Ultimately, while the bill was signed into law without that alignment, the bill did not include funding for that purpose. And so right now, although the structure is there, no funding has been put towards the implementation of AB 1111 in the way it was framed as of yet. In terms of last year's budget, we saw largely status quo, which was not entirely surprising. As you all, I believe, know, we start our conversations with the Department of Finance and Legislature well in advance of the governor releasing his January budget. So it wasn't a surprise to us when the budget was introduced last January in 2017 with just the status quo of $500 million for the Adult Ed Block Grant. That said, based on feedback and conversations we had had, particularly with Department of Finance, regarding concerns about the AEBG being a quote-unquote grant, Adult Ed Block Grant, and the concerns that we've heard from some school districts throughout the state, as well as our community college partners, about that grant being signifying to local community CBOs that is short-term funding, and the concern that results from that about the ability as an adult school to hire teachers, full-time teachers, staff, and grow programs versus holding back some level of those AEBG funds for potential downturn later. So finance, while they didn't agree to change the term grant last year, really did try to put forth an olive branch beyond what they've already done to explicitly say that the funding was ongoing in the budget language. Additionally, they included some trailer bill language, Department of Finance trailer bill language, that really is very explicit that AEBG funds are for adult education only. And that was very positive, certainly addresses concerns we've had in the past along the lines of categorical flexibility, where school districts were able to flex that money and to use it for other purposes. This language very clearly walls that off, requires those funds to be placed in a different account only for the purpose of adult ed. Relative to our 2018 framework, hopefully you all have seen this. This is included under the CCAE website in particular, under legislative and under advocacy materials. You'll find a link to that document there, so definitely encourage you to take a look at that if you have not had a chance to do that. And I'm seeing a quick question here. Thank you for jumping in, Patricia. The TBL is basically the shorthand for trailer bill language. So that is, trailer bill language is essentially kind of the policy implementation of the actual fiscal budget bill. And so trailer bill language will include kind of those policy details above and beyond the actual funding information. And also, really quick side note, thank you, Patricia, for weighing in with your question. I would definitely encourage all of you to kind of give us a little chat in that Q&A chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're connecting from. Also, it'd be really helpful. We know sometimes groups will get together to watch the webinars. And so if you are in a location where you have multiple people in the room, we definitely appreciate you letting us know where you are, who you are, and how many people you might have watching the webinar with you. So with that, continuing into our 2018 framework, we are really, again, focusing in on a number of different things. And I'm really actually pleased to let you know, too, a little spoiler alert, we've actually had a couple of our priorities already addressed as part of this year's budget, which is very exciting. We'll get to momentarily. But above and beyond what we've continued to hear over the last couple of years is concerns about the inadequacy of funding under the Adult Ed Block Grant and the concerns with increasing costs, as well as the inability to share expand access and capacity for programs. So in that regard, we had a lot of conversations about what makes sense. What makes sense? I mean, we've talked a lot about in the past that, prior to categorical flexibility under the K-12 system, we were funded at over $750 million, and that was just for K-12 adult school programs. And so really wanting to kind of get back up to that level from a funding perspective. So we talked a lot about that and, how valid and viable that would be for this budget cycle. And also, thinking about, okay, long term, what would be helpful in terms of addressing some of those ongoing cost increases, as well as trying to see, is there any additional, mechanism via funding that we can utilize and push for that kind of helps address some of the concerns around the term grant, and that it's not perceived by some as not being long-term funding. And so in that regard, we opted to take a lower proposal for increased funding into the adult ed block, but pair that with, not separate from, not instead of, but in addition to that, pair it with a COLA going forward for adult education. So where we fell out was we really needed to make sure that we could defend those numbers, that we didn't just pull them out of a hat. And so we came up with the number of $110 million of increased funding for adult education, which is in part based on the CLASP white paper. And if you haven't seen the CLASP white paper, we'll make sure to have that available to you. But essentially it's focused in on kind of some kind of incentivizing funding for serving communities of need. And certainly we know as adult schools, that is exactly, the types of students we serve are those in most need. And so that's one piece of that. The CLASP report recommended $30 million specifically just for this purpose. And so we adopted that in part as part of our justification for the $110 million. Additionally, we put in place about another $30 million based on the Legislative Analyst's Office recommendation that any, adjustment or movement to eliminate fees, not that we're doing that, but any adjustment in what the fee policies might be for adult education will require a backfill of funding. And at that time, the LAO recommended and believed that to backfill the funding that's being charged for CTE fees now would be somewhere in the realm of $30 million. Now, it might be a little bit higher, and we've heard from some already that they think that would be higher, but in terms of a defensible number to start out of the gate with and justifying additional support, as well as helping to alleviate some of the fee constraints for students, that $30 million for CTE was a good starting point. Additionally, and finally, as part of that $110 million, we opted to include about $50 million for growing access to programs, as well as to help continue to address the ongoing cost drivers associated with that. While, AEBG funding, we know that a good deal of that each adult school receives, if not the bulk of it, goes towards teacher salaries, pension, STIRS, PERS, and overall costs. And certainly, by and large, those have been covered by what you have in your adult ed block grant allocation now, but that's at the expense, without having kind of additional funding to help cover those costs, that's at the expense of growing those programs. And so the $50 million, we believe, will help, given that you're in theory, generally speaking, kind of, at the max of your budget, covering those costs and access to programs. $50 million would be a good amount to help address those ongoing costs with, adding teachers to perhaps cover additional classes and growing that access by adding classes. So that's kind of where we came up with that, and that was kind of the big picture justification for the $110 million. In part, relative to kind of the class type of piece of that, where we're really kind of trying to incentivize serving and continuing to grow programs and opportunities for communities of need. We talk about a little bit, and perhaps using just a small percentage of that funding to help, be incentivized funding for those communities of need and serving them, and kind of on a performance-based approach. And that was in part largely because we have heard that there's an interest down the line of moving towards performance-based funding. And we believe that by and large, our adult schools in particular are very well positioned to deliver those outcomes. Further, given that we are asking for, a large chunk of funding for the Adult Ed Block Grant, we really felt like that would be kind of, a good olive branch, if you will, good, thing to offer that we could meet only just but a small percentage of that funding versus the whole thing. And it would be a good olive branch to say, look, we're committed to doing great things with this additional resources, and we're so committed that we'll prove to you that we can deliver the outcomes for those communities of need that we would get this funding for. Additionally, we have asked for that COLA, and so again, it would be the two together, not one or the other. And then additionally, we, as part of our communities of need, interest, and serving all of our communities, really also looking to incorporate immigrant integration metrics that are based on the Allies framework. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in just a few moments. But essentially, the interest there really being not doing necessarily something completely new, but leveraging what many of you are already doing now to ensure that all of our students have metrics by which we can evaluate their progress and outcomes. So we've also often talked about it as part of our meetings with the legislature and finance, that if you consider students on a spectrum of, program deliveries and outcome, when we look at the Adult Ed Block Grant Framework language, the language itself is only explicitly calling for measurement and outcomes, according to AEBG, based on strict literacy, which, kind of falls maybe towards the middle of the spectrum, if you will, a strict literacy basic skills, and then on the far right side of that spectrum, career path, development, progress, and those sorts of things. But what we're concerned about from a long-term perspective is just having the tools available to us to ensure that our immigrant students who might not yet be on the spectrum of, meeting those strict literacy and basic skills metrics and outcomes may need kind of some other measurement of the beneficial outcomes that they're achieving, and acknowledging the great work that you're doing at the local level. Again, this would be permissive, not required, not a mandate, but again, just providing an additional tool, particularly for those adult schools who are serving large numbers of students that may be immigrants. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that means. Also make clear and try to share with you that it wouldn't be reinventing the wheel. It's actually leveraging what we're already doing, very much in line with EL Civics and those sorts of programming and outcomes-based approaches. So we'll get more into detail on that in just a moment. Additionally, we've asked and have been working with Department of Finance as well as Department of Education for the last year and a half at least regarding indirect rates for adult education. Many of you may know that school districts have kind of their own individual indirect rates. It varies from school district to school district. And ultimately that kind of covers, when they charge it back to an adult school, will cover things like, human resources, accounting, professional development and training and what have you. And what strikes us as, adult education providers is that certainly, some of those services may be things that adult schools tap into. But when it comes to things like, training, professional development, adult schools often have their own professional development rather than tapping into that a traditional K-12, district and K-12 providers are really focused on. And so charging a full freight indirect rate that a district may have set may not really be warranted in terms of kind of the return on kind of that cost benefit. And so you may recall that prior to categorical flexibility, CDE under Education Code statute had the ability to establish an indirect rate specifically for adult education and adult schools. And essentially at that time, that language was used where CDE would basically survey the land of all the different indirect rates throughout the state that school districts had, and basically take the average of that and set that as the adult education indirect rate. And so it was really kind of a standalone, very specific rate set for adult schools. And when we started talking with CDE and Department of Finance about utilizing that again now under AEBG, it came down to the fact that because that statute was included as part of the old adult education statutory requirements, that it was no longer operative now under an AEBG world. And so essentially we've been working with them to make some headway to reestablish some kind of cap, average, what have you, in statute for all adult education block grant funded entities, so that there was more consistency. We've heard anecdotally, well, not even anecdotally, very specific examples of districts who may be right next to each other, and one district's charging, upwards of 12%, whereas the district right next door is only charging 4%. So certainly there was a concern about, the inequity of that, particularly relative to the services actually being utilized, and the concern that that obviously takes away from programming that should, in theory, be going directly towards, programming for students in the classroom. So we proposed as part of our approach to cap it at 5% or less, which again is consistent with the average that was typically in place under Education Code statute when CDE was setting that. And then finally, grant in the adult education block grant, really continuing to push for changing the term grant to something that does actually mirror and is consistent with kind of ongoing fundings, whether that's adult ed block funding, adult ed block apportionment, what have you, really kind of utilizing terminology that is more indicative and clear that it is ongoing long-term funding. And then finally, regarding CTE and CTE fees, you may recall that under Senate Bill 173, when we were working with Senator Carol Liu before she termed out of the Senate, we worked with her on that measure related to adult education. And one of the components of that that we still have yet to address, among a few others, was looking at CTE fees, how they're established, and kind of if there was some different approach that should be undertaken to ensure that CTE fees were set in a reasonable manner, that they weren't too high for students, and that were more consistent in terms of their setting. And as we've kind of dived into this even further, clearly CTE fees are very complex in terms of how those are set from one adult school to another. Certainly we're not setting fees higher than what our students are able or willing to pay for them. They're often very competitive in terms of other providers in the area, if not certainly a more cost-effective alternative. And some adult schools are leveraging federal funding opportunities through grants from the federal level, and others are using AEBG dollars for that. Additionally, we know that costs are different from one part of the state to the next, where in Calaveras County, as an example, an LVN teacher and the costs associated with delivering that program could be vastly different than an urban Los Angeles county program, where the teacher would be potentially much more costly or less, what have you. But obviously those costs are different depending on where those programs are being delivered in the state. So ultimately, we really just kind of refer back to the $30 million we put into the $110 million funding approach, really saying that we think that it's important to grow access to those programs, as well as do whatever we can with that funding to help decrease the fees that are charged to students wherever possible, but just really providing at this point some flexibility to consortia and adult schools to decide how best to leverage those funds, with the understanding that those fees should be reasonable and really speak to the costs of the program, not from the perspective of bringing in more money than what is necessary. And as you guys will all well know, and you've heard me say many times before, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu in Sacramento. And what I'm really happy to tell you is that this year we're at the table, and at the table in a very big way. When we looked at the governor's budget proposal this year and those conversations that have ensued since it was released January 10th, we're looking very well as a state fiscally overall, with funding certainly well positioned to be well above the Prop 98 requirements, LCFF fully funded, as well as additional funding plugged into the rainy day fund at the state level. Really, and in that regard, I'm told meeting the cap for the rainy day fund, and also still having additional funding thereafter. And this is only, beginning of February, folks. when we're looking ahead and hearing even from budget staff in the Capitol, from the LAO and others, they believe that the May revised numbers will, when it's closer to the beginning of the new budget year and closer to closing out the current budget year, they believe the revenue numbers will be even higher. So in terms of our ask for 110 million, it's a very reasonable ask, particularly with COLA. What's really great is we've already won 2 of our battles relative to those priorities, as the governor included COLA for adult education block grant partners and members in the budget. So these not only provided COLA for 1 year, but actually technically for 3, although one of those years didn't actually have a COLA associated with it. We're really looking at a COLA that backfills from, I think it's 16-17, and then again for this coming year as well. So it's a great starting point and certainly far better than we could have hoped for coming out of the gate. And I think really opens the door to a lot more discussion about that 110 million that's also part of our ask. Additionally, the trailer bill language, and again, trailer bill language is the policy framework to implement the budget bill. So the fiscal implementation language goes into the trailer bill. And that did include the indirect rate cap that we were asking for as well, which is great. So congratulations to all of you. We've already seen 2 victories, and we're not even halfway through the 2nd month of the year. So great. Additionally, they've included a little bit of kind of cleanup relative to education code that they've been working with CDE on, that essentially takes the 3-year planning cycle, provides an additional year, and makes some kind of very thoughtful changes in that way, in the way those plans are put together and the timing of that. So now we're wondering, okay, what else? So those were the main components of the governor's budget, but we're making a lot of good headway on some of the other things that we were asking for. So in terms of feedback and insight, generally speaking, we are feeling very, very positive. I mean, certainly the governor's budget provides us a great starting point for the work we're doing. Department of Finance has been a great partner and actually spoke at the CAEAA conference just this last Thursday, answering a whole host of questions, which is very positive. We've developed a very good rapport and working relationship with them and are continuing those discussions. Additionally, the Senate and Assembly Budget Committees have been very positive and open to the rest of our priorities as well. And even just this past Friday, after the close of the CAEAA conference, Victoria Abate, the alleged chair for CCAE, joined me for a meeting with the Assembly budget staff, who indicated very, very directly that our asks relative to 110 million are incredibly reasonable, and that definitely, there's a good opportunity to make headway with that. Further, on the immigrant integration metrics, that again, those as well were very reasonable and made a whole lot of sense, much less the term grant. And the grant, if nothing else, is kind of a really surprise to me, because we've been talking about the concerns associated with that term grant for some time, and yet we've just not made headway. I keep hearing from staff saying, look, Dawn, we think this is much ado about nothing. We're, messaging, we're calling it ongoing explicitly. And yet I've continued to beat the drum, as have all of you at the local level. And so this year, I would say, is the first year where Senate and Assembly budget staff are actually finally bending and agreeing, okay, yeah, we continue to hear this. It's not just from you guys, K-12 adult schools, but from a variety of different entities, including our community college partners who are really grappling with that same issue. So, we'll see how that plays out. Finance is still a bit stuck, not wanting to feel like they need to go about rebranding all of Adult Ed Block Grant with some other acronym. So we'll see how that plays out, but really feeling quite good. The LAO as well has been quite positive, and certainly working with Natasha and the team over at the LAO's office. Natasha also joined us at the CAEAA conference last Thursday, kind of giving us an overview not only of the governor's budget, but also some of the community college budget items that maybe could be indirectly related, as well as some of the alignment issues around kind of reciprocity, fees, what have you as well. And then most exciting, I think, is the opportunity to really make some great headway together with some other stakeholders and our partners. So certainly we're in this AEBG world together with our community college partners, and I believe we've made a great deal of headway in terms of getting them on board and support. We've been doing a bit of work over the last few months with ACE, the Association for Continuing and Community Education. It's really the non-credit association in the community college world. And they have been very positive about our request, and we're even talking about possibly submitting a joint letter of support for those requests here in the next couple of weeks, next month or so. So very positive. Additionally, reaching out to other stakeholders, other school districts, as well as ACCA, CTA, the Teachers Association, and others. So really more to come on that, but on the partners front, going quite well. Additionally, relative to some other stakeholders, we've been working very closely with some civil rights and immigrant rights organizations who are also very positive about the work we're doing, particularly related to funding and the need to grow access, as well as immigrant integration metrics, and wanting to ensure that the immigrant students we serve have the ability to demonstrate outcomes, and that adult schools have the tools they need to also demonstrate that you're doing good work. So really very, very positive, and I imagine we're going to see additional support coming forward. We've even heard from a few legislators thus far who are interested in also helping us push for additional funding. So I think we're really in quite a good position. So in terms of a little bit more detail, again, we talked a little bit about this, our proposal being $110 million requested on top of the COLA, the $30 million for CLASP and communities of need, percentage for performance-based funding for those communities of need, $30 million for CTE, and $50 million for increased access per STIR salary costs for new programming. As well as grant, we've talked a bit about that, and so far kind of mixed feedback between Department of Finance and Senate Assembly, but by and large, progress potentially on the legislative front. But let's talk a little bit more about immigrant integration metrics and what it is we're proposing. So the proposal really is based on the Allies framework that's and the work that's happened down in the San Jose area with the South Bay Consortium for Adult Education. And really it's intended to be an innovative way to really identify and measure those critical factors for successful immigrant integration. It's again really just kind of a great tool that we believe would be a really good thing to include, given that there's no specific metrics for our immigrant students beyond just the strict literacy, basic skills, and career. Again, it's based on a collaborative of these organizations here, South Bay Consortium, Allies, and Working Partnerships USA. They did a great presentation for us at the CAEAA conference last Friday, providing a little bit more feedback and insight into the great work. And really intended to be, kind of flexible for you all to use, again, as a tool at the local level, not mandated. And ultimately, at the backbone of this are really 8 goal areas that are further defined based on kind of each different little pot, if you will. And these are just suggestions, but again, meant to be tools. And you'll see some of the things in here that may look familiar to say, oh, well, we're already doing this, English proficiency and measuring that, high school equivalent in first language, and some of those sorts of things that you all are already kind of looking at and already working with students on relative to the work you do today. Essentially, at its core, even further diving in, it's really kind of referencing EL Civics and kind of the work you're already doing. So again, this isn't actually reinventing the wheel whatsoever. It's taking the work you're doing in and around EL Civics, et cetera, and really making sure that those data points that, indicate your students' progress and where they are in terms of their outcomes, and kind of essentially redirecting those in part to account for immigrant integration benefits and outcomes. And so, again, not mandatory, but as applicable for the population of students you're serving, intended to be a tool and based on the work that's already being done in and around EL Civics, et cetera. And this was CASAS and the Allies team led by Bob Harper, Dr. Bob Harper, and Ilsa Paulette with Allies. I stole some of their slides, so I did ask first for whatever it's worth. But essentially, this were some of the great slides that they had put together through CAEAA, pulling a great deal of wonderful data to provide a bit more insight into kind of what we're talking about. And again, this is really based in kind of the EL civics world. And these are some numbers about kind of the numbers of students we're serving relative to citizenship preparation, civic participation, and IELCE. And really, again, that this is really the foundation for that and kind of aligned to what we're doing already under WIOA. Additionally, some additional points relative to the types of objectives that are currently being used by you all in adult ed. And again, really just to kind of reassure you all that what we're talking about here is largely what you're doing already, just building upon that, enhancing that, and making sure that that work also can account for, you know, measurement of outcomes and performance for you and your students, particularly for immigrant students who, again, may not be yet all the way through to that spectrum to strict literacy, basic skills, and career. A couple more things. And again, the intent would be, you know, for, you know, those parts of the state and your regions and your consortia where there may be a high need relative to immigrant communities, that you might consider integrating these into your regional plans. There's been some work done via the AEBG office to recognize immigrant integration as part of kind of the approaches and activities to be undertaken at the community level through your consortia. So certainly there's already a headway been made to recognize that and to move that forward. And again, just working on building stronger connections as well with public and private partnerships through the work that you're already doing to serve those communities. So again, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we said we're at the table, but we can't be comforted by that. We can't feel complacent to think that all of the work is just going to continue to go quite well. Oftentimes, you never quite expect, you know, that bump in the road that ends up veering you off course. And so really, really want to urge you all to help with the strategy and help move us forward on this. It's really going to take all of us. Obviously, we have an advocacy plan we've put together, looking at and working on coalition building, both with education partners, as well as additional stakeholder outreach and working with external organizations to move our agenda forward. We have a very focused advocacy approach that we're working on within the legislature, with the budget committees, policy committees, individual legislators as well. Further, we've strengthened kind of the approach with hiring through CCAE, media and public affairs assistants through McNally Temple Associates and their representative Kelly Reed. Many of you may or may not have seen, but we have been putting out regular distributions, just one-pagers to the Capitol, to the legislature, finance, what have you. Really, you know, intended to have kind of very strong, striking pictures with a very clear and direct message. Would really encourage all of you to take a look at those. Again, those are on the CCAE webpage under legislative and advocacy materials. Those are great tools as well that you can just print off, particularly those handouts that I'm speaking of, print out and kind of take with you as part of a packet when you go to visit your local folks as well. Certainly we're doing the webinar today. We do intend to set up a couple of more webinars, particularly as we get closer to Ledge Day, so definitely watch for those. And relative to Ledge Day, really want to hope and encourage all of you to participate in Ledge Day this week or this year. Legislative Day at the Capitol will be on Tuesday, April 10th, where you'll do your Capitol visits. But we're doing something a little bit new this year. We are feeling so positive and like we are on such good footing and have great opportunities that we are actually putting together an adult education rally at the Capitol on Monday, April 9th. Now, many of you come into Sacramento on Monday to, you know, prepare via the briefing we do Monday afternoon, which we will still do. But if you can, we'd really encourage you to come in earlier on that Monday, hopefully by around noon. Assemblyman Kevin McCarty, who's based here in Sacramento, serves as the chair of the Assembly Education Budget Subcommittee, will be introducing and presenting the Adult Education Week resolution on the Assembly floor that Monday, 9th at about 1 o'clock. So would love to have all of you be able to be present and recognized in the gallery for that presentation. And then following that, we have a rally, as I mentioned, that's being planned on the steps of the Capitol, which should be phenomenal. We're lining up a couple of speakers from the legislature, and we're also going to be reaching out to some of you to ask for great stories and candidates. We'd like to consider having a couple of students who might feel comfortable making some comments via a microphone and platform in front of the Capitol, share their great stories and their outcomes and the great opportunities that adult education has provided them. So if you do have a particular student you'd like to maybe have considered that would be able to join us at the rally on Monday and stay for our Capitol visits on Tuesday, April 10th, I would really encourage you to let us know. And then last but certainly not least is our local grassroots activities, we have asked in the past, as of this last fall, for everyone to put together an adult school info sheet for each of your schools, talking about the students you serve, where you're located, what programs you offer. Additionally, nothing really formal, but just anecdotally some information regarding wait lists or how many students you're having to turn away because of access. That information is particularly important for us to understand and have a sense of. Given that we're pushing for additional funding to the tune of $110 million, we want to make sure we have sufficient information based on kind of what the needs are, what lack of access is available throughout the state based on kind of stagnant status quo funding. And then finally, doing your meet and greets, your legislative visits, education of your local elected officials, and local coalition building. So on that CCAE webpage, under legislative and advocacy tools or materials, you'll find not only this framework that speaks to these individual priorities, you're also going to find those handouts that our media and public affairs firm McNally Temple put together that you may use. Additionally, we've put together some talking points for the priorities that remain. And we're really focusing in on 3. Because remember, we already have the COLA in the budget. We also already have the indirect rate issue in the budget. So what we have decided to focus you all on in terms of the advocacy and your asks at the local level with your local elected officials is to focus in on the $110 million additional funding, the term grant, and the inclusion of immigrant integration metrics recognized by AEBG. So those talking points are available on the CCAE website for you to download today. Additionally, there we've put together a draft letter intended to be a coalition NASCAR type letter. And many of you recall when we talk about the NASCAR letter, we're focused in on kind of the NASCARs that you see in racing that have all the different pretty, very striking logos on their fancy cars. Well, it's those logos that you're often like really drawn to see, okay, well, who is supporting this racer? Who's backing them and kind of their quest for victory. And essentially, our NASCAR letter is intended to be the same way, for you all to do local coalition building with your boards of supervisors, local chambers of commerce, individual, business entities, community-based organizations, et cetera, to have them sign on to your letter in support of adult education and these asks, and utilize their logos at the top of that letter, even more so and more importantly than even a signature, so that you can use that in terms of your advocacy with your senator and assembly member in your community. They'll look to see who in my community are backing these asks, and that's very powerful in terms of building that support. So we're asking you guys to go ahead and download that letter, make the adjustments that you may see fit, and try to get as many signatories on that and back out and a copy to us as possible by the end of February. Additionally, I want to say to you all is that I really appreciate all the work you do on a daily basis. But I do want to say too that our success depends on you guys engaging with us too. And I know you've been wonderful about stepping up to the plate and doing kind of that heavy lifting at the local level before. really hoping you could help us out and do that. We're so close that we just think with a little bit of more momentum from you all at the local level on these specific targeted asks, it's really going to send us across the finish line. That said, in terms of timing, the budget committees are not at this point poised to hear the adult education budget until the end of April. Now, that makes you think, oh, wow, we have plenty of time. But the reality is that we don't have that much time. If we're going to make headway for these additional asks, either to be in the governor's May revised budget proposal or for the legislature to take them up and add them themselves to the budget, we've got to get them, you know, solid and nailed down here within the next 2 months at most. So in that regard, waiting till Ledge Day to come up and do your asks and to connect with your local officials is not going to be early enough. We really are hoping that Ledge Day is really just you guys coming up here to really seal the deal. And so definitely encourage everyone to get out there in the field, meeting with your local colleagues to get them to sign on to that coalition NASCAR letter, as well as doing your meetings with legislative staff in your districts. That happening sooner rather than later is really important. So with that, I'm going to stop there and see about who might have questions that they'd like to ask. So I know we do have a few here, so bear with me. I'm just going to quickly run through them. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in with your information about where you are. I'm seeing someone asking, Valerie asking to show the slide that has the 10 most used co-ops in EL Civics. So bear with me, I'm going to go back to that. So there are actually 2 pages of them. So here's one, and then I'll change over to the second one momentarily. Okay. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Get back to it here. All right, Adriana, can you see my presentation? I apologize. I think I accidentally hit
no, I can't, Dawn.
Okay, my apologies. Bear with me one moment here.
Okay.
Adriana, do you need help?
I believe Dawn needs help to bring her presentation back up.
Okay. So, Dawn, if you go down to the bottom of the screen where it says share screen, that green button down there, that's what you want to click on.
Okay, hold on one second here. Jumping back in.
You're going to need to have it open on your laptop in order to pull that up.
Got it. See, I knew I wasn't going to be like that good. I was mess up. Anyway, okay, so I can't see you guys, and I'm going to keep working at it. In the meantime, Adriana, maybe you can see if there are any other questions since I'm not able to access it at the moment.
Right. So let's see. You answered the first question, and then we got some information about Kathleen. And I answered the question from Jojo Reyes about the class report. And actually, we had someone else give us the link to the class report. I'm not seeing that right now, but you actually don't have any other questions.
Okay.
That was the one that I couldn't get to you, Dawn, because you have it in your slides, and I apologize for that. That's why I didn't answer that one at all.
No, I apologize. And I apologize. I obviously hit a button and can't seem to get back into it. Nevertheless, happy to answer additional questions that folks have.
The other thing is, I do see that we have a question that says, can we download this presentation? And I'm pretty sure that you had said that this presentation will go onto the website as soon as the recorded webinar goes in onto the website.
Right.
That was one of the questions that someone had, and I answered that one, and I don't know if that went to everybody or not, but as I said earlier, there it is. It's coming back. Yeah, you got it back. There it is. Okay.
Okay.
There they are. And I'm not sure if the person who requested those had a question about them. Let's see, hold on. Okay, so Valerie says, has the 4.1% COLA been approved, or are we asking for it?
Good question. So nothing has been approved as of yet, but the fact that the governor included the COLA in his budget proposal, that's very good. The legislature is poised to move that forward. None of this, of note, will be official and approved until the legislature votes on the entire budget package by June 15th. So this is all still a work in progress. But at this point in time, we have no reason, absent some, massive change in budget circumstances that would be unforeseen. We don't expect that to change, but that won't be solidified until June.
Okay, and then Dawn, you have another question from an anonymous attendee asking, what about the additional $5 million for assessment? Is this for consortia level work or state level work?
That's a great question as well. I apologize for neglecting to include that. So the $5 million for assessment was also included in the governor's budget proposal. And it's a good question about whether it's for consortia level work or state level work. I believe what we heard this last week is that at the state level in the AABG office, they were planning to keep that in-house for use. Which has been something that we've heard mixed reviews on and concern potentially. And so we definitely need to get a bit more information about that and better understand the logic and thought process there. But we will definitely be back in touch with that. And let's see, could you show the 10 most CO? Let's see. There we go.
I think that's the slide you have up.
Yes. And can the language in the COLA request say that it is for teachers' salaries only? Unfortunately, I think not, and largely because this administration has focused in on providing the maximum amount of flexibility for decision-making and use of funds. So certainly the COLA is intended to directly help with salary increases, and PERS and STIRS. It's certainly something we can inquire about, but I believe at this point their interest is really to keep things as flexible as possible for the determination about what that should be used for at the local level, but certainly it's something that we can ask about. Other questions or comments?
I do have a message from Victoria Abate, CCAE's Ledge person, and she says she appreciates the questions about Ledge Day and the information you're providing about Ledge Day, Dawn, and that she looks forward to seeing everyone at Ledge Day.
Great, wonderful. Any additional questions that folks have? Anything I can clarify for you all? Great. Well, thank you all so very much for joining the webinar. Hopefully this has been insightful and informative for you all. I will say again, just to remind you that a lot of these materials, as well as the recording of this webinar and the presentation as well, will be all available on the CCAE website. And certainly those handout materials on the PR front will be available. We'll be following up with more information as we get a little bit closer again to Ledge Day. We'll be putting together some packet information for you at the state level to leave behind with your local legislators when you visit with them here in Sacramento. Definitely are going to want you to bring up some of your materials that you're working on at the local level as well. But definitely more to come on that. We definitely hope you're going to reach out to your local assembly and senator and keep us posted, and definitely let us know how those conversations are going. It's often helpful if I know that you've just had a meeting with your senator or assembly member, so that when I go in to meet with them and their staff as well, I can reference those meetings to really, tie it all together, that the work we're doing and I'm doing on your behalf in Sacramento is also directly attributed to the conversations that they're having with you at the local level. So,
and Dawn, one other thing I think you wanted to mention, if they need to make their appointments with their legislators, although it is in March, in April, they need to make them early.
That's a great point, Adriana. Yes, so definitely try to go ahead and get started on those appointments. You will note that most legislative members now have a different process for asking for appointments. So you might need to provide a bit more detail on that. And I would just really encourage you all, as Adriana said, to start to navigate that process now. It's not difficult, more just, asking for a bit more information and kind of a more formalized process that they'll be asking you to go through this time. But you can find all that information and their contact information on their individual websites via assembly.ca.gov, G-O-V, or senate.ca.gov. So definitely start that process now. We have Sacramento folks already have 9 meetings set up with their actual legislators. So definitely, setting them early is really a great opportunity to better ensure, doesn't guarantee, but better ensures the opportunity to meet with the legislator themselves. So great feedback, Adriana. Thank you for that.
Sure.
And then if there's nothing else, I think we're all set. Just again, we'll be more back in touch. Definitely take a look at those materials on the website.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Alrighty. And you have one last comment that says teachers in K-12 need to get permission to go to legislators. I'm not sure if we need more detail on that comment or not. Since I don't know who it's from, I don't know who to follow up with. Maybe you can email me or Dawn directly. My email address is execdir, the abbreviation for Executive Director, at ccaestate.org, so that we can get a little bit more detail about that comment. And Dawn can help us out with that. So just that is the last thing I see. Thank you, Dawn. And okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll be back in touch soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, Dawn.